We are back on the Zero Hour. What we will be discussing in this segment is an opinion piece by Gordon Marino on whether it makes sense to follow the philosophy, do what you love. Gordon Marino is a professor of philosophy and director of the Kierkegaard Library at St. Olaf College. He is a Kierkegaard expert. It's clear from his bio, and he's co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Kierkegaard, as well as a number of books, including Modern Libraries, Basic Writings of Existentialism and Ethics. And before we go any further, Gordon Marino, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate your interest.
Oh, absolutely. You know, this is one of those things where, again, it kind of bubbles just below the surface of consciousness. In me, anyway, and I think in other people, when people say, do what you love, do what inspires you, do what you love, and you'll never work another day again. And so it's like, hey, I look at the economics data all day, number one. That seems like a one-percenter's affectation in a way, or luxury. And number two, you know, it may engender a lack of discipline. You write about student advisees coming to you, and one of them saying, should he be a doctor or a philosophy professor? Maybe he'd be a stand-up comedian, and your reaction is to say, what are you most passionate about? But so you wrestled with this because you saw an article in Jacobin magazine essentially taking that view that it's elitist, but you wrestled with it from a number of different dimensions. And what were your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I thought a balance. There was a kind of an imbalance there. There were people thinking in terms of vocation, just in terms of their passions and their likes. And historically, you know, the notion of vocation has been connected with some sense of duty, and I think to some extent we've lost that. And I also think it's important for people to be able to work hard at things they don't like doing, you know, the things that need to be done that aren't particularly fun or don't connect with your passions. And some of the do-it-your-love philosophy kind of undermines that.
Yeah, I got that from what you wrote, and I thought that was interesting. First, I mean, there are different dimensions of duty, too, and I think it's worth mentioning that at this point, too. You know, you mentioned your father didn't do what he loved. He labored at a job he detested so that he could send his children to college. My father kind of liked what he did, but it wasn't his passion. It wasn't what he wanted to do. He came from that class. You got to get a job, man. This is the world. And so we've got that dimension of it. So I would say our fathers had a duty that extended to family. Then you mentioned Martin Luther King and other great leaders who are certainly, I mean, I'm sure when Martin Luther King was going to Memphis at the end of his life to help the sanitation workers get a living wage, that was not, quote unquote, necessarily what he loved. He might have been preferring to write beautiful sermons and read, theological.
He was quite depressed at that time.
Was he?
Yeah, from what I understand, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And depression is part of the process of sacrifice. He might have been preferred to read and analyze the works of Niebuhr or another great theologian, but there he was doing his work. So I think there's that dimension of it. Now, I might argue that it's not, and I want your thoughts on this, that doing what you love and doing what you're passionate about are not necessarily synonymous. That King was passionate about social justice, even if he didn't love it, and even if he found it depressing. But I think that I'm glad you mentioned duty, because that seems to be the through line. Whatever happened to the idea that you do what circumstance and opportunity and your own talents obliges you to do out of a sense of duty.
Right, and that's something that seems to be getting lost with a certain economic class of people. Right, the idea of doing something just out of a sense of duty or because you need to is hard for some students to relate to. Not so much for the kids I deal with in town. So the idea of doing what you need to do, you know, I think is important. And so there's a certain kind of narcissism in the way we approach vocation, I think, today. You know, that was really the issue I was responding to.
Yeah, I think narcissism and perhaps, wouldn't you say, what's the word, immediate gratification, an inability to defer gratification?
Well, but also a recognition that very few people are in a situation where they can do what they love. Right? That it's only a certain kind of class of person that can do that. Again, most of the kids I'm also a boxing trainer, so I run a boxing gym for years, and I have a lot of kids that are economically challenged, and they're in no position to do just what they love, you know. So it's important for people who do follow that philosophy to recognize it's quite a privilege. Now, again,
Sure.
sometimes there is a tremendous harmony between. You can be doing. I was certainly not arguing that if you love doing something, you shouldn't do it. Doing what you love really does tend to focus us in certain ways, and we're much more liable to be successful at it. But it shouldn't be the bottom line of everything, of all our choices.
So let's talk it through for a second. You're a student advisor. You advise students a lot, and let's talk about those underprivileged kids at the gym. Mm-hmm. Okay, they don't have the luxury of saying, well, I'd like to be a pointillist painter or study the history of pointillist painting necessarily.
I'd like to be a pilot, yeah.
Right. But on the other hand, if they're a good boxer, they might be able to be a gym teacher. If we don't stop cutting education programs and gym programs, right, which is another whole story. So would that be a case where maybe there's a balance between, you could say to a kid like that, look, hey, you like to box, you're good at it, you're an athlete, you could help other kids when you become an adult. This is something you might want to balance. The duty comes in as well as the aptitude and as well as the love. Should we start thinking in those terms maybe?
Well, yeah, I think context is really important in terms of offering advice. You really need to know the situation and talents of the person you're talking with a lot of the time. But it's more of what, for those kids, they have a deep sense of what would be best for my family, and their talents enter into it. So we do think a lot about what are your talents, what are your but trying to develop some sense of to diminish the vulnerability of those economic vulnerability is important. So I really push some kids to get there's a certain amount of freedom if you get a welder's license or something like that.
Yeah.
And I even with students in college, to tell you the truth, because depending on what their situation is, but it's a quite different discussion with these different groups of young people.
Yeah, based on what, socioeconomic class or something?
Yeah, definitely based on economic class. Like, for example, there's students who can go to college, and there's been a lot of comments to the effect that, everyone's in such economic debt when they come out of college that, they should be able to do what they want or something to that effect. And there's a lot of students who can pay their full way, don't come out with any debt. They're very privileged and can look for a job. They can, take internships and jobs that are other people wouldn't be able to afford to, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge those differences.
Oh, absolutely, and you take it. I sometimes deal with some of these issues of student employment and so on from an economic or policy perspective. You take it from a philosophical perspective. You quote Kant from the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals as saying, let's suppose a person, quote, finds in himself a talent which might make himself a useful man, we would say, or woman today, in many respects, but he finds himself in comfortable circumstances and prefers to indulge in pleasure rather, end quote, rather than use these capacities. Right. You used an interesting word. I thought you were going to go on to say that Kant says it would be immoral to indulge in pleasure when you have a talent that would make yourself useful, but you use the word irrational, which I thought was interesting. Well,
for Kant, they'd be synonymous, I think. He would say it would be irrational to you couldn't will a world in which people abided by a rule, do what you just feel like doing, because we have certain talent, we have certain talents that serve certain purposes. So for him, those two things would be synonymous.
So, okay, well, that's interesting. So it's irrational to behave in an immoral way, and that, of course...
his claim would be, he always asks, look, could you will a world in which people just let their talents rust and do what they just felt like doing, skateboarding or whatever? He says, no, you couldn't logically will that kind of a world.
Well, and that's
the way he kind of thinks about it. I'm sorry.
And that's an ethos that needs to be brought into the conversation, I think. And by the way, there's a Kierkegaard quote, which you're going to tell me I mangle or misremember, but as I recall it from many years ago, it was something to the effect of life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. So, and the reason why I hope I got close, but the reason why. Yeah, and the reason why I bring it up is because I think the other element that gets lost from this whole discussion of doing what you love is doing what's in front of you. Right. Doing what's, okay, you just got out of college. There are no jobs for interpretive dancers, but there are jobs for guys who can stack trucks. Let's hope we create an economy where there are jobs like that again, which was one of my first jobs. And then I went on to do financial analysis and kind of self-taught, computer programming. Well, as it turns out, it can only be understood backwards, but that's what I do for a living now, is use that experience to interpret, So I guess my point is, and I'm not the world's best model on career choice necessarily, but I guess the point is, isn't also doing what's in front of you and then doing the next indicated thing a part of a kind of morality of careerism?
Yeah, that's a good distinction you're making. I never thought of doing what's in front of you. And oftentimes you do what's in front of you and you find out you do really like it. You might not think you're going to like it, and you do like it. One of my very best students ever, he went to teach for America, and it was torture the first year. And he was just threatened all the time and felt anxious, and it was unbelievable. And now he went on and he stayed on the job, and he loves it. It's so impactful. It's not always fun. It's very challenging, but he loves the impact in the relationships. So oftentimes we really can't tell what it is, whether or not we can learn to love something.
Well, that's such a great point, because of all things, I found myself having to project the financial impact of health plan, benefit design, or whatever. It sounds like the dullest thing in the world, and probably is, but I love that too. It was just a side of my mind I didn't know I wanted to tap. So I guess if I were to conclude, and I'll give you the last word, but if I were to conclude, I guess I would say that career in an ideal world would be the product of a dialogue among duty, talent, necessity, and opportunity.
Well, I think that's right. Yeah, and I think we lost some of that dialogue, at least amongst certain people. And I'm trying to redress that balance. But yeah, those are the elements I think we need.
Well, thanks so much for illustrating this issue with your great piece in the New York Times on doing what you love and the limitations of it. Gordon Marino, professor of philosophy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for a good discussion. I really appreciate it.
Me too.